Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The magnificent Indian Air Force, IAF, is now observing its 92nd birthday. We'll talk about this. To talk about this, also with me is Snehesh Phillip, who at ThePrint is our Chief of Air Staff, not just the Chief of Air Staff, but Chief of Army Staff and the Naval Staff and Coast Guard and everything at ThePrint. I didn't say anything else. That said, while we'll talk about the state of the Indian Air Force, the questions being raised, let me first of all start with a note of condolence. And Snehesh will join me in this. That is for the death and also the injury to so many people who came out of sheer enthusiasm for Indian Air Force, both for the people of Indian Air Force and machines of Indian Air Force. Military aviation is very exciting. It's very exciting. The sounds as the aircraft fly overhead, the sounds, the speed, right? The aerobatics, all of it. And while on the one hand, it's a very heartening thing that nearly or more than 1.5 million people came out in Chennai, and it's a good initiative on Modi government's part to hold these Armed Forces Days, Army, Navy, Air Force in different cities, different parts of the country. Otherwise, these were all held in Delhi or Mumbai for the Navy. That's a very big change and a welcome change. However, this led to this tragedy in Chennai. So once again, our condolences. Should not have happened, and maybe lessons will be learned from this about over better crowd management the next time, because now we know what kind of enthusiasm the Indian Air Force generates. So while saying all of the stirring stuff that the IAF chiefs say on the eve of Air Force Day, and Indian Air Force, as I said earlier, is a magnificent force. It has been up to the task whenever called upon to deliver. From 1947-48, the Kashmir operations, where we might not have seen any air-to-air combat, but Indian Air Force was involved both for transport and supply. In fact, but for Indian Air Force, Indian troops would not have reached Srinagar in time because the raiders were just about to reach Srinagar. They had crossed Baramulla. They were on the outskirts of Srinagar. And that's when Indian Air Force Dakotas were able to bring in the Indian troops just in time, in the nick of time. So they've always been up to the task. So while giving his usual stirring statement, the Air Force Chief, Air Chief Marshal A.P. Singh, also sounded a note of caution. He said that the squadron strength of the Air Force, or the overall strength of the Air Force, he indicated has been falling, and he said we will fight with whatever we have. So Snehesh put that in perspective.
Well, that's a very interesting comment that the Air Force Chief said. We'll fight with whatever we have, and this he was speaking in context of the fighter jets. So in the Air Force, the sanctioned strength of the fighter jets squadrons is about 42 squadrons, right? As we speak, as of now, the total number of squadrons that the Air Force has, and again talking about the fighter squadrons, is 31, right? So you have 31 fighter squadrons as against the 42 that has been sanctioned. But what is interesting is the fact that while 31 looks good on paper, at least it's just down 11. But the fact is that in terms of actual numbers, the numbers are actually much lesser. For example, the 31 squadron is made up of 2 squadrons of the MiG-21 Bisons. Now, both these MiG-21 Bisons have been combined together, and they now make about 10 or 12 aircraft instead of ideally it's about 16 plus 2, 18. 16 plus 2 is the ideal strength of any squadron. So if you take out those 2 MiG-21 Bisons, both of them would be phased out next year. It falls down to 29.
In fact, should have been phased out already many years
ago. Absolutely. So it falls down to 29. Then if you look at the overall, the 29 squadron strength, it is made up of 2 Rafale squadrons. These are, the Rafale jets that were bought under emergency procurement in the Narendra Modi government. Then you have, of course, 3 squadrons of the Jaguars, right? Besides that, you have 2 Tejas squadrons. Now, these two Tejas squadrons are, the Tejas squadrons which are made up of the IOC and the FOC configuration.
IOC is initial operational clearance, FOC is final operational clearance. So all the aircraft are not fully operationally cleared. I mean,
Yeah, they have.
push comes to the shove, they'll
Yeah.
be used,
Yeah,
but
they will
are
be
not
used.
top of the line combat aircraft
Yeah,
in
they're
their
so
category.
both of them are based on Sulur, and that is more to do with training and doctrine formation, warfighting formation that the Air Force works on.
Sulur, as many of you would know, is deep in the south.
Yes. And then you, of course, have the Mirage squadrons, which is about 3. And then you have the 3 MiG-29 upgrades. The rest is made up of Sukhois. So Sukhois are about 15 squadrons of the Sukhois in the Air Force. Now, that's one way of looking at the numbers, right? In terms of if you take out 29 squadrons. But there's another way of looking at it, and which is more alarmist in nature, is the fact that the serviceability ratio of each of these squadrons are very different. For example, now we may have 15 squadrons of the Sukhois. At best, the serviceability ratio of the Sukhoi is 60 aircraft, right? 60%, which means that out of every 100 aircraft that the Indian Air Force has, only 60 at the best is available in case tomorrow there is a war. And now these numbers keep differing from aircraft to aircraft, with of course the Rafale enjoying nearly about 90% serviceability ratio.
Well, I think what you meant to say was alarming, not alarmist. Alarmist would sound like we are raising a false alarm. No, so that's a bit alarming, because these are Sukhois are very heavy aircraft, very heavy and very big aircraft. They also guzzle a lot of fuel. Also, they've imposed a burden on the Indian Air Force in the sense that they cannot be fitted into any of your conventional hangars or shelters. You've had to
Because
build
of the
special
size.
new hangars for them. And also because they are of Soviet origin. We can see right now, and this is something that's evident in Ukraine as well, while Soviet origin or Russian aircraft are beautifully designed, they have a lot of good things, they have a lot of power, for example, in their engines, but the missile gap between the Soviet origin or Russian origin aircraft and say the NATO aircraft or NATO missiles, a gap does exist.
Of course, and that's the precise reason why when the Balakot strikes happened, the Indian Air Force did not put in use the Su-30 MKIs. They used the Mirages, because the Mirages carried the long range weaponry that was there. They had better radars, better instruments and weaponry. So that's the reason why.
So while Sukhoi 30 MKI actually has much more power, could have carried much heavier warload or bomb load in carrying out the attack on Balakot, but one, they are large, they have a big radar signature, and second, they did not have sufficient air-to-air protection in terms of the range of the missiles, which at that point only some Mirages had, the Mika missile.
Yeah, the Mika missiles had just come in. Of course, you have the R-73 and the R-77 that was in use with the Sukhois. But if you remember, the next day when the Pakistanis carried out their reverse attack, at that time there were 2 Mirages and 2 Sukhois, who were carrying out CAPs, that is combat air patrol, and when the Pakistanis F-16s fired on the Sukhois were completely outgunned and outmatched, right? And so they had to take tactical retreat, as one would say it.
Yeah, evasive
measures was taken. So because they were completely outgunned by outranged by the Pakistani fighters.
Yeah. However, our squadron strength is lower than it was in 2019.
Yes, the squadron strength is lower than what it was in 2019.
Because more big squadrons have been
phased out since then.
So how is the Air Force managing? I know that quality matters, but quality, as Stalin said famously in warfare, quantity also is its own quality. So quality doesn't mean that you have 2 squadrons of Rafales. So Pakistanis or the Chinese will only send you aircraft at a time when you can confront them with aircraft from these 2 squadrons of Rafales. 2 squadrons of Rafales are too few. 2 squadrons of Rafale, 3 squadrons of Mirage 2000s I don't know how many of them are now equipped with Mika missile, which pretty much
yeah,
matches the range of the
yeah,
Pakistani AMRAAM.
yeah.
I don't know the radar situation there. Now, what burdens does it put on Indian Air Force? These numbers. I mean, how significant are these numbers? It's as we talk, it's about 31 squadrons. Now, 42 squadrons was always a bit aspirational. In fact, when I was growing up as a defense correspondent, say 30 years ago, then the aspirational number was 45 squadrons because there was always a sanction of 45 squadrons, a dream of 45 squadrons
For a two-front war scenario.
for a two-front war scenario. And the highest Indian Air Force reached was, I think, by 1996, which was about 41 squadrons.
Yeah.
And that's because a lot of the legacy aircraft were continuing. They were still useful. All the mix series,
Yeah, 23,
20,
27.
23, 27. In fact, if you drive to Delhi's airport, Indira Gandhi International Airport, as you go towards T3, Terminal T3, you see a trophy MiG-27 hanging there because those have been retired now. Those were all active active in 1996. But none of these has been replaced since then.
Yeah.
Except the Sukhois, which came in for a multiple role,
Yeah.
replacing many of the others.
It came in batches.
It came in batches. So first of all, does a big aircraft like Sukhoi make up for, say, 3 other aircraft?
Well, it all depends on the kind of role, the operational role or the operation that has been carried out. Any aircraft, the whole question within the Air Force is about whether numbers are needed or capability is needed. Some would say that you have 2 Rafales and the capability wise it is much higher than, let's say, 3 squadrons of Sukhois or 4 squadrons of Sukhois, much higher than, let's say, 5 squadrons of the MiG-21 Bisons. But then the counter argument to that is that, as you rightly mentioned, the 2 squadrons of Rafale is much less, right? You have a situation in which both Pakistan and China, your arch rivals, are focusing big on on their air forces. They are flying 4.5 generation, they are flying 5th generation fighter aircraft, right? So those are things that will have to be taken into account, and that is the precise reason why the Air Force has procurement plan which involves like, for example, the 83 LCA Mark 1As that have been ordered for, the delivery of which was supposed to start in March, but it has been delayed. There is an order for 97 more LCA Mark 1As that is in the pipeline. Then you have the LCA Mark 2 also, right? So about 6 to 7 squadrons of the Mark 2s will also be ordered by the Air Force. And then you have, of course, the 5th generation fighter aircraft, which is AMCA. So in total, the Air Force would be flying about 400 of these aircraft, of the Tejas series and the AMCA included.
But that will be by 2035.
That is
at the most optimistic.
At the most optimistic, yeah. Right? So
that's 11 years from now.
11 years from now, and that is at the most optimistic. But at the same time, for example, the Air Force Chief talked about MRFA, right? That is multi-role combat aircraft.
Multi-role fighter aircraft.
Yeah, multi-role fighter aircraft, the MRFA, which is what the Air Force thought about once the 36 Rafales were bought, right? It was early the MMRCA and now the MRFA. And when it was asked, the chief said, and he said it very, it was an important statement. He said we needed MRFA as of yesterday.
Yeah, because the chief, before he had become chief, when he was vice chief, in one of his public appearances, had said that indigenization, Atmanirbharta, all of that's great and that's a preferable thing, but that should not become a constraint on your military capability.
Absolutely, on the military preparedness.
Yeah.
And that was an important statement that he made. So while he's all gungo about indigenous production, indigenous fighters, he says that by 2047 all Indian fighters have to be made in India. So when he talks about the MRFA also, he's talking about MRFA which is manufactured in India, he's talking about the Tejas, he's talking about the AMCA, but at the same time he's also talking about wanting to bring in a private production line when it comes to the Tejas series. And that is where something which I wanted to ask you is because when I was initially doing my Tejas stories long back, much before I was part of the print, one of the initial stories that I read was yours on the Tejas. I think this was way back, and an article that you had done for India Today way back in 1985 or 86.
85.
85. How do you see this Tejas journey itself?
Well, first of all, I will set the timing context. In 1985, when the cover story was done for India Today, for India's defense modernization push, that's what Rajiv Gandhi did. Rajiv Gandhi upped defense budgets greatly,
Yeah.
while defense purchase scandals ultimately ruined his legacy. But the fact is, that was the first time India's defense budget went more above 4% of the GDP.
Wow, 4%.
In fact, it was 4.21% of the GDP. Now, for the past 10, 15 years, it has stayed below 2% of the GDP, right? So he inducted a lot of new things, and that's why that cover story was done. In fact, just to tell you a side story of that, if you see that cover picture of that issue, that's a Mirage 2000. So that was the first Mirage 2000 squadron under induction at that point.
Yeah.
And the squadron commander then was Ajit Bhavnani, who later rose to be an air marshal and head of the chief of the Strategic Forces Command.
Okay.
So he was raising that squadron, 7th Squadron in Gwalior. So that picture was taken there. That said, at that point, there was already a very ambitious program to develop an LCA, light combat aircraft. Nobody called it Tejas then. Tejas is a name that Vajpayee gave later.
Yeah.
Right? Vajpayee gave later when the first prototypes
2001.
came out. 2001. He gave the name. Now, this was being developed. Some of India's top scientists were involved in developing this. At the same time, there were challenges. The challenge at that point, India lived in an environment of big technology denial. So what engine were you going to put into this, right? Americans were not about to sell you an engine in the 80s, right? Cold War was still on.
Yeah.
And to fit a Russian Soviet engine also would have been tougher because Soviet engines are designed based on a different doctrine. That means almost as if oil comes for free, titanium comes for free, all materials come for free. And the idea was to have an indigenous, a genuinely Indian aircraft. So what they did right was they got a very good design. They got a very good design which has endured, because ultimately the same design has been worked upon. So that was great. But there were many other things that were missing. For example, they were worrying, all right, even if we get the engine, from where will we get the fly-by-wire, right? From where will we get the IAF, identify friend or foe. So all of that was there. And I was taken to the Aeronautical Development Agency in Bengaluru, which I again had the opportunity to visit just a few years ago when I recorded a series of walk the talks. One with the scientists involved with the Tejas program, with the Tejas development and AMCA development, and that's where we got this picture of this model, and you can see the scientists also us talking, and also on the assembly line on the HAL side. Now in 85, 86, when this was being developed, there was also a very ambitious engine project.
Yeah.
It was called the Kaveri project. It looked very impressive. The fact, however, is that engine is still not with us. And unlikely the engine will be with us for a very long time. So this compromise was arrived at because Indian-American relationship improved and Americans then became willing to give you the engine for the aircraft. And that's how Tejas started to fly. However, the delays with the Tejas and now further delays with the Tejas are not helping anybody. So HAL is now like a company which is sitting on a big order book. Its stock price is going up, right? Because it has not just a monopoly in the market, but it also has a monopoly of the customer. So customer has no choice. It can't go anywhere else. Whereas HAL holds the customer captive, right? And in between, there are all these uncertainties of the engine coming from GE. And I think some other critical components also. You mentioned about one that is delayed from Denmark.
Yeah, that was a charge amplifier, which has now been indigenized. It was supposed to come in from Denmark, which has been put on an export ban list by Denmark because of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. So that has been indigenized, but it's all going to take time, and eventually so that's what the Air Force chief said. that if the HAL has promised actually production of 24 aircraft per year. So HAL, the IAF chief says that if the HAL is able to fulfill or stick to its promise, then this initial delay is something that they can cater for. But if not, then it's big trouble.
But think about it. Even if HAL is able to give 24 aircraft a year, to get that order of 83 plus 96 will take forever.
97, yes, will take forever.
Take
And
forever.
then not to forget the Tejas Mark II and the AMCA also, which the HAL will produce.
Yeah, Tejas Mark II will also need the new engine, that is
Yeah.
414,
Yeah.
which is supposed to be co-produced in India. So building a fighter aircraft is complex. Procuring a fighter aircraft is also complex because nobody has spare fighter aircraft that they can sell you off the shelf. Okay, Americans sit on so many F-16s lying in the desert, parked in the desert that nobody is using, but you don't want those old aircraft. You
Exactly.
want newer aircraft. But at the same time, the fact is that Indian Air Force has also been looking for some of the older aircraft that can still be useful. For example, Mirage 2000. Mirage 2000 came into service in 1985. As I told you, the first squadron, the 7th Battle Axis, came up in Gwalior, and since then has been the frontline aircraft. Again, Balakot, Mirage 2000 was used. War in Kargil 1999, it was the Mirages that made the difference, because
Yeah.
earlier all the other aircraft were not able to make a difference for the simple reason that they were not able to fire smart ammunition. At that point, smart meant laser guided. So it is the Israelis who then supplied laser guidance kits for
Yeah.
the bombs that Mirage dropped, and that's how Mirages made the difference in Kargil
In
as well.
Kargil.
So Mirage has been the frontline fighter. Now, a little sort of sad story about the Mirages is that late 90s, Vajpayee government got an offer from Dassault to shift the entire Mirage assembly line to India.
Yeah, because they were shutting the Mirage line
because
down.
they were shutting that line down. So India could have built as many Mirages as they wanted and also exported. Plus, India would have become the hub for spares
Exactly.
and development and repairs for Mirages held by all air forces. But Vajpayee government came close to this, but ultimately got cold feet because the Helka scandal happened at that time. And they didn't want to be doing anything major in that environment. So that's one of the tragedies. The fact, however, is that still Indian Air Force is looking for any spare Mirages. They've been talking to Qatar, which has a few of them. There are reports that I see in international military defense media that there are also some initial discussions with the Taiwanese. So Snehesh, if more second-hand Mirage 2000s are found, you think they'll be used to replace one of these mixed squadrons, or just be used as what you call as Christmas tree, which means strip apart an aircraft and use it for spares. So those become gifts. So it comes bearing those spares as gifts as a Christmas tree comes.
So India did procure certain limited numbers of Mirages from France, which are being used as Christmas tree, right? But in this case, the one that is in negotiation, in talks with Qatar, these are about, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 8 to 10 Mirage fighters which are there. These is most likely to be raised as a separate squadron of the Mirage 2000s, because it is different from the ones that India operates. India operates the upgraded version of it. So these Mirages, if they have to be upgraded, is going to cost a lot. Which means that it makes no sense for them to be upgraded and merged into the existing 3 squadrons of the Mirages. So these are likely to be raised as a separate squadron, which would also mean that you'll have to train the pilots again, a certain set of pilots again, because these are different in terms of how it operates and the systems on board from the ones that India already operates.
So this numbers problem remains. 31 minus 2 MiG-21 bis, right? Minus 2 Tejas, the first model, right? IOC, FOC. Yeah. So that is 27 squadrons.
Absolutely.
Of these 27 also, a bunch of squadrons are Jaguars, which are more than 50 years old. Although India has been upgrading them. But really, it's difficult to see those aircraft going anywhere even close to hostile airspace. They'll maybe
Absolutely.
I think 8 of them are optimized for maritime strike role.
Maritime strike role.
But the rest, they make up the numbers. So the numbers gap for the Air Force is now steep. It's now quite sharp. And also the quality gap is sharp because IAF has probably the best quality aircraft in the subcontinent. Let's not compete with the Chinese right now because we don't know what they have and how does it work, the J-20s, for
Yeah.
example. But if you look at the Pakistanis, these Rafales are better than any F-16 version the Pakistanis have,
Absolutely.
along with AMRAAMs.
Absolutely.
But there are too few of these. So India has a quality gap as well, and that's what leads to situations which can give you an initial setback in an engagement, as happened with Abhinandan's MiG-21 base in 2019. And
Yeah.
we saw some of this happen also in Kargil, where in the first couple of days, India lost a MiG-27, a MiG-21, and also a Mi-8 helicopter, because those aircraft were not yet optimized for a hostile environment, crawling with surface-to-air missiles. So Indian Air Force has a real challenge.
Of course, Indian Air Force has a real challenge, and that is something that that multiple Air Force chiefs, right? So he's not the Air Chief Marshal AP Singh is not the first one to say this. His predecessor also said this. His predecessor also said this, right? So it's like a chain which goes.
But as they go from chief to chief to chief to chief, and from Air Force Day to Air Force Day, the only thing that changes is the strength, the squadron strength of the IAF, and unfortunately, it only changes for the worse.
It only changes for the worse.
Keeps falling. So what is the reason these chiefs and all the system also, everybody knows there's a problem, they are not able to address this issue?
See, address this issue for this, like for example, Air Force procurement plan, as I said, involves the MRFA. A decision on it is yet to be taken by the government. So the Air Force has not literally moved the file to the DAC for clearance, because first the Air Force needs to have a clarity, or the government needs to tell the Air Force under which procurement route would this process be undertaken.
What are the different procurement routes?
See, one would be the DAP 2020 under the Defense Acquisition Procedure of 2020, which would mean that it would be a repeat of the MMRCA. So you will file for RFP, would be issued, multiple contestants would come in.
Trials
will take place. Then you have the whole negotiation they have to tie up with the Indian partner. You'll have to select the Indian partner. So it's going to be a long drawn process. Remember that it was way back in this MMRCA program was initiated under the Vajpayee government, right?
India has not bought an fighter aircraft like that ever.
Yes, as in following this procedure ever. It has never. Every time we've had a
either
G2G, government to government.
The Soviet era was different anyway.
Yeah, even the Mirages, when they were bought, it was not as if a competition was held and there were trials that took place, right? Yes. So the government is yet to give them a signal. So Air Force then only can move. Then comes the Tejas Mark 1A. So the Air Force did what it could do. In 2021, the Air Force went in for the order of 86 Tejas Mark 1A, the deliveries of which were supposed to start in March this year.
Yes.
So the delivery has not begun. Then you, of course, have the additional 97, which was not initially planned, right? Additional 97 has now been planned only to ensure that the decreasing squadron strength is arrested. Then you have the Tejas Mark 2, as per the, this was something that the Air Force Chief mentioned, that as per the ambitious plan that have been set forward by the ADA and the HAL, the first flight of the Tejas Mark 2 is supposed to take place next year, right? In December next year. So 1 year from now, the first flight of the Tejas Mark 2 is supposed to take place. And by 2027, the entire trial is supposed to be completed, and 2028 it is supposed to go into production. I can tell you for the fact, no one in the Air Force or anyone that I know of, even among journalists or others, are really sure about this, about this timeline of the first flight of Tejas Mark to be undertaken next year. So there are challenges when it comes to it, right? So and that is the precise reason why the former Air Force Chief, Air Chief Marshal Vivek Ram Chaudhary, mentioned about the need to have a private production line, to bring in private players into the production of the aircraft, so that the numbers go up.
Which also gives HAL competition.
Which also gives HAL competition.
Because
Which
right now HAL is a monopoly with a captive customer.
absolutely
Because the important thing is that it's always been said, oh, it's not just the machine, it's also the man behind the machine or woman behind the machine or the combatant behind the machine who matters. The important thing now is while who's operating the machine, who has a trigger, that matters. That those skills are very important. But the fact is that all aerial warfare, increasingly all warfare in all three dimensions, even on the ground, as we see often in Ukraine, but all aerial warfare is now beyond visual range.
absolutely.
So this era where you had dogfights and the era of kinetic warfare in air is now over, and that is where all mindsets have to change, and that's where India at this point lacks the numbers, and until a couple of years ago lacked the missiles also because it was outranged, and that gap between India and Pakistan had been allowed to persist for too long. Whatever happens, whichever way it happens, we do hope that Indian Air Force gets more aircraft because its inventory is really dwindling to alarming levels. Not alarmist, we are not alarmist. We agree with the air chief. India will fight with whatever it has, but that's not a good line for our chiefs to have to use. We shouldn't be forcing our chiefs to use that line.
Absolutely.
Once again, condolences to the families of those who lost their lives in Chennai, and also those who injured. Our sympathies are with you, and may your family members recover very quickly.